Welcome back to the Ultimate Guide to Python. Today we're going to be covering conditional statements, specifically if, else, and while statements. So we're going to be going in Python and we're going to be looking at how do you write a line in code where you have to fulfill a condition in order to run the rest of the code. And there are several ways of doing it. There are for loops, while loops, if and else statements, but today we will specifically be covering those three things that I said: if, else, as well as while. We'll cover for loops more in next week because they're not necessarily more complicated, but they can have more complicated aspects to them. So first things first, what is an if statement? An if statement is basically saying if this condition is true, then run this line of code. And if you want to add on to that, you can also say if that condition is not true, then maybe if this condition is true, and then you write a second condition after the phrase else if. So what is an if statement? An if statement is basically just saying that if a condition is true, then you're going to want to run this outcome. And if you want to, you can add other ifs attached to that, which you'll write as else if. And what happens when you write an else if statement is that if this condition is true, it runs this code. If it's not, then maybe it matches the condition in this line and it'll run this code. But if it's still not true for either of those statements, then what you can do is write an else block, which covers all other scenarios. So if it doesn't fulfill either condition 1, condition 2, or however many conditions you have, then you write else, and it'll just write whatever is in the else statement. If you don't forget, or if you forget to write the else, I should say, then you're not going to do anything. The code will just skip over the if statement, and it's not going to have done anything. You're not going to have any output. You're not going to have a return statement. With that brief intro out of the way, let's go to while statements. And while statements basically is a loop. And what a while statement is doing is while a certain condition is true, you're going to continuously run a certain lines or a certain line of code over and over again. And there are several ways to end this loop. You can use a break, which will just simply end the while loop while you're inside of it. Or you can write code inside of the while loop itself that will cause this condition to become false. And so with those explanations out of the way, we're going to go into Spider and look at some practical applications of both use cases. Okay, so now that we're here in Spider, let's look at the most simple ways to implement an actual if statement and an actual while statement. So what we're going to want to do first is we'll want to create a variable like we did in the last video. And so to this variable, we'll assign the integer 15. And for our if statement, we'll say if x is greater than 15, or better yet, if x is greater than 10. If x is greater than 10, then we're going to want to return, or my bad, let's print x is greater than 10. And if you look to the console, because it fulfills the condition, it prints x is greater than 10. If x was instead 5 and we printed it, it wouldn't print anything. It skips over the if loop. But if we wanted to cover for that condition, we'll say else if x is less than 10. Or you don't even have to do that. You can just write else. But I'll set it up so we can use else as a third condition in the future. So else if x is less than 10. So here, as you can see, we just ran into an issue where I mixed up my syntax between languages. In Java, you'll write it as else if, but in Python, although I was fairly sure that you could use either elif or else if, it seems in the application I'm using, Spider, it'll want you to use elif, right? So elif is just the shorthand for else if. So you write elif and then you write your condition. And to be on the safer side, I'd go with this if you're gonna use an else if block, but it's basically the same in other languages as well. Just use elif instead of else if. And so you have elif x is less than 10. And because it doesn't fulfill this condition, but it fulfills the second condition, it writes x is less than 10. But maybe we say x is greater than 6 and less than 10 for the else if statement. And for the else statement, for the elif statement, x is greater than 6, less than 10. And for the else statement, we'll say that we'll just print x doesn't fulfill the conditions. So as you can see, it'll run to the else. So this is just anything that doesn't fall under the else if or the if conditions. It's a very simple application. It's not very hard to get down. I would recommend you practice doing multiple things with it, not just using variables, but more complex scenarios, like maybe you set, or not even necessarily complex, but using different data types. Maybe you'll say x is true, and if x is false, then print this value, else print this value. And you can, play around with that using a bunch of different data types. So we go to the console. X doesn't fulfill the conditions because x is not false, x is true. Now let's briefly look at while loops. So the first part of the while loop, of course, is the while. And there are a bunch of different things that you can do here. Maybe you'll do what I did last time where you set x equal to 10. And then you say while x is less than 15, add 1. And there's something curious here. You'll notice that I wrote plus equal to 1. In Python, instead of writing x is equal to x plus 1, and then assigning that to x to make it a new variable of x plus 1, which would then be 11. I said that kind of complicated, sorry, but in this normal instance, we're making x 11 because x is initially 10, you're adding 1, that's 11, and then you're making the new x 11. So this x no longer exists. X is no longer 10, x is 11. But in Python, you can shorthand that. You can say x plus equal to 1, and you're just adding 1 to the number. And so this while loop will is essentially adding to x until x can no longer fulfill the condition. And so as you can see, it goes 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. But once x is 15, it is no longer less than 15. So it no longer fulfills the while condition and it stops. This is a loop. It will keep going until this condition is broken. You could say while true, and unless you have something to break this, what's going to happen is that your while loop is basically you're going to go forever, and you're probably going to crash your system. I would run it, but I think it's going to crash my spiders, so I'm not going to do that because it's just going to run indefinitely. But another way you can break it is by just using a break statement, just saying break. Maybe you'll have a condition to that, like maybe you'll make a nested if statement. So you'll say if x is greater than 15, then break. So the condition is while true, print x, add 1 to x, and if x is greater than 15, you're going to want to break the while loop. And this does the exact same thing. But in this situation, because the condition is if x is greater than 15 rather than if x is less than 15, then it's going to go up to 15 before it finally breaks. Now, if we remove that if statement and we just say break, then what's going to happen is the break is going to happen after the first occurrence of the loop. So after it runs this segment, it's just going to immediately break. So it'll only run the loop once. And as you can see here, it just prints out 10 and it automatically breaks. So there's a lot of cool things that you can do with if and while statements. You can put if and while statements within each other to do a lot of different things. You can stack conditions, which is basically what that is. And by building on this simple and fundamental concept, you can make much more complicated programs which will rely mostly on these concepts. For loops will also be very important, and we'll be covering that in the next video. But that's it for today. I hope you got a lot out of the video, and if you liked it, please like the video, subscribe, and come back for more. There are more videos on the channel, of course, part 1 and part 2 if you missed out on those. Check them out, and I'll see you in the next one.
없으리